Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's wonderful to see you all. It's a little gloomy outside, but you can be sure it's going to be pretty sunny as Darnell leads our workshop in the next hour and a half. As you know, this is a workshop titled Restoring Imagination. And we're going to go from now till 2:40 or 45. My name is Tim Lee. I teach at Brite Divinity School. I teach church history and also direct Asian and Asian American Pacific Islander Church Studies program there. I'm also an ordained minister in Disciples of Christ. I've been active mostly at general level of the church, serving on a variety of boards and also on the moderator team between 2017 and 19. So it's wonderful to see you workers, frontline workers of our ministry seeking to advance the reign of God here. And our speaker today is quite a distinguished leader of the church, especially of Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And I'm just going to read this introduction that you all have. Reverend Darnell Ferrell. He serves as the Director of Social Entrepreneurship for National Benevolent Association of Disciples of Christ. He has extensive nonprofit management experience and a track record of planning and leading initiatives that have consistently flourished. He is a founding and lead pastor for Just Love, a virtual community, a new disciples church, where members are advancing intersectional justice in Houston, Texas. While pastoring, he served as a faith community organizer for Faith in Texas, a PICO affiliate, and the Texas Freedom Network. As an organizer regional director, Darnell built relationships with clergy and congregations across many faiths, provided training, managed teams, and led congregations to action around racial, LGBTQ plus economic and immigrant justice. He received his Master of Divinity from Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California, and a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from the University of Houston. In his role, Darnell supports NBA's efforts to equip and support disciples who are starting innovative, forward-leaning ministries of compassion and care in their own communities. This includes encouraging social entrepreneurship and equipping entrepreneurs as they grow their ministries into nonprofit. So we'll have Reverend Ferrell give his talk, which will run for about 50 to 55 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes of Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that warm welcome. And thank you, Ministers Week, for the invitation to be able to share with you all on this rainy afternoon. As we gather into this space, I recognize this is not for me just a workshop or presentation. This is a sacred moment. I hope that we don't enter it just simply from an intellectual standpoint, but also from a spiritual standpoint, recognizing that the still speaking God is inviting us to restore imagination. Keyword restore, which means it's always been there in you and in our tradition, but perhaps due to the many things that sometimes get in the way of imagination, that we have somehow lost it. But let this be a moment of restoring, rekindling, that we may go forth being the church that God is calling us to be in this moment, one that is doing social impact work, one that is taking seriously those on the margins, imagining a new future, imagining a world that works for everybody. So, friends, I want to invite you on this 7th day in Black History Month to think about not just Black folks, but all folks who've imagined, who in the midst of devastation, in the midst of oppression, in the midst of hard and difficult times, who have imagined new possibilities, who have courageously saw new visions in the midst of bleak realities. So I invite you to get comfortable in your chair, perhaps close your eyes if you want to, and think about an individual or individuals who you've seen. Maybe they are well known, maybe they're community folks, family folks, church folks, who have imagined. Because we want to remember that therefore we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses who have imagined, and they set the table for us in this time of exploration and conversation. So I'm going to invite you to think about folks who've imagined, give you about a few seconds to think about a name, a person, how they've imagined. With their name now on our heart, we want to lift their name aloud. Lift up their name aloud. In no order, just speak the name into the room. So it is. Amen. So, friends, we know imagination because we know folks who've imagined. You've already spoken their names. And you too have the ability to imagine. I want to invite you now, let's get to it. You have in your hand a Post-it, one Post-it. You should only have one. And the instructions are as follow: one Post-it. Remember, our conversation is about imagination, so now is the time to unlock, to begin to teeter with imagination that's within. Some of us have a little dust on our imagination box, but it's still there. Take this one sheet of paper and make something new. Imagine a new possibility for the paper that you have. Some of you may say, I'm a preacher, I'm a text person, give me a biblical text to interpret. No, I want you to tap into another side of your brain. Take the Post-it note, create something different. It's wide open, the possibilities of what one can create. Give you a minute to think about, where am I going to go with this? What am I going to do? It's important for us to be able to strengthen the muscle of imagination and creativity, moving from our often text-driven life as ministers and move into the tactile, touching, creating, building, exploring, playing even. Yeah, playing. Ministers can play. Yeah. It'll give us about 3 minutes to do this. Take your time. Hope nobody's feeling pressured. Creation is happening. I hear papers folding, tearing. All right, and as a former educator, one of the good ways of being able to digest what we've just done is to turn and talk. Find somebody around you and introduce them to that which you have created. What did you create? Some of you may feel a little embarrassed. This feels a little vulnerable for you. Lean into it. It's important. Lean into it. Sure, thank you. You have the handheld mic, so I'm gonna ask some feedback, maybe 2 or 3 people. We should have both shared by now. Both parties should have shared. I'm going to invite us back. Thank you for indulging in this moment. I'm going to invite us back now. As the description said, this was going to be an interactive workshop. Some of us may be uncomfortable already, but it's important for us to engage this in a playful and exploratory way. So you have just been introduced to folks imagining what a piece of paper, a Post-it rather, could become. I want to invite maybe 2 people to share what they may have been inspired by. Somebody had a very good idea. They just want to share it out. Anybody feeling proud of what they created? Oh, all right. That's what we're talking about.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. With this paper that I also did a little origami with, I created a real-time camera with audio that's attached to a drone that goes around the world witnessing and recording, not spying, but witnessing and recording. I know that's what you were thinking. Witnessing and recording moves of the Holy Spirit.
Wow, look at innovation, creativity, imagination. Okay, one more.
Speaking of Holy Spirit, I tried to make a fire.
Okay.
And it's already sprouted a flame and landed on a new brother's socks. So since it only takes a spark to get a fire going.
There you go. Thank you all for engaging in this activity. This is just kind of a runway for our time together. We centered ourselves by being able to call forth those who've imagined. Now we have imagined by creating from a Post-it something new. I want to now bring official greetings on behalf of NBA, our health and social health ministry of the General Church, as well as the Southwest region and all the ways in which I serve in the Christian church. I bring you greetings, and I want to kind of just share about how imagination finds me. Now, of course, I can tell some childhood stories, which I will get into, but I want to start with what it means to be leaving your final year of seminary. Folks are preparing for search and call, and they are entering information in. They have preparing now for ordination. They are preparing their future as a settled pastor somewhere. I remember talking to a colleague, white male, and we're sitting down having coffee about what's happening post-seminary. And he said, quite frankly, I'm not really worried. I'm a white, straight man. I know I'll find somewhere to land. He wasn't being mean. He was just being real about the reality of what it meant to be him in the world. What's your plan, Darnell? Well, as a black, non-straight man in the world, I was like, well, I'm doing some imagining, right? I'm doing some imagining. I'm thinking about some nonprofit work, having a social enterprise. I had to really think outside of the box. I'm thinking about starting a church because I knew that there weren't going to be many options for me to be able to walk into easily. And in doing so, and spending several years imagining and working toward creating and building out nonprofit, social enterprise, new church plants, the door would open for me to be able to work with general ministry as the director of social enterprise, bringing forth all that imagination and trying and work to be able to help support other individuals across our church as they imagine creating nonprofits and creating impactful ministries in their community. That's how imagination begins. At that moment, that coffee shop, I didn't know how the story would unfold, but I was going to try some things on. I was going to fail. I was going to get myself up and keep going forward. And that is imagination, friends. We have a tradition that is rooted in imagination. Our biblical tradition is rooted in imagination, but it's so strange that sometimes people of faith have strayed away from imagination. When we see imagination so clearly in the biblical witness, let's imagine for a moment a large rock. I didn't do any slides. I didn't do any text. I want you just to use this brain and begin to visualize things. Imagine a large rock. Many of us see it only as a rock. Some of us saw the Post-it only as a Post-it or a piece of paper. We were fixed in the form that we were given. Our mind was fixed in the form. We couldn't get beyond the form to see new possibilities. As you imagine that large rock, can you also remember the story of liberation in Exodus where God takes a rock and brings forth water from a rock? No, this is a rock, though. Rocks don't bring forth water, no, but we have to move beyond the form that we thought it had to be and imagine new possibilities. Moving beyond fixed forms, seeing new possibilities. Can we imagine together now a river? River flowing rapidly. We see it as a river, a body of water. But our biblical witness gives us imagination to see a body of water being split open, becoming a pathway to liberation and new possibilities. If we only just saw it as a river, if we failed to imagine something different, then we would not be able to experience liberation. But because of our willingness to see a rock as something else, a river as a new possibility, and even our final thing, what does it mean to take some sticks? Think about sticks you've seen, twigs, sticks, large, small. They're just sticks, we may say. But what does it mean in the Exodus story where the water is too bitter to drink? God tells Moses to put a stick in the water, and suddenly a stick becomes sweet and low, providing a sweet taste to bitter tasting water. What does it mean to move down to the Christian scriptures and think about the devastation happening in the book of Revelations and all of the oppression that's happening in the early Christian church? And for the writer to pen this visionary statement, "Behold, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first one had passed away, and now a new one was coming down from heaven." How dare you imagine such? How dare you have such audacity to imagine a new vision in the midst of what is? Friends, I want to invite you back. May we stir up that imagination, because it is a part of our tradition that we are called to do this kind of work together. But again, as I said, we somehow lost that imagination. But as we engage today's topic, the hope is that we as ministers begin to see the importance of imagination and to see the importance and practice of engaging the practice of imagination, that we may together be the church God is calling us to be. How many of y'all struggle with the paper and the sense of seeing it beyond paper? Raise your hand. Like, nobody? Some of us like, it's paper. I can't get beyond the paper right now. You're saying post it, but I see it as only that. In imagination, we have to be able to move beyond the form that we are seeing and see a new form. And sometimes the form gets us paralyzed and stuck. I see it only as this is the worship service. This is the way we do our meetings. This is how child Christian education goes. This is how we evangelize. Can't see anything beyond this. This is the form. But do you know this was not always the form? But because of innovation, imagination, the form that we have now in our hands is actually inherited because other people have challenged the form and evolved the form. But somehow in the church, it takes us many years to be able to push beyond the form. We're always about 30 years behind in the sense of imagining a new form. But we were thrust recently into having to imagine a new form because of the pandemic, and now things are slowly returning to what we are familiar with, and some of us are going back to the form. But that was a moment to let us know that you really can imagine new possibilities and not have to be forced to do so, but to do so with exploration, to do so with a sense of excitement. Friends, we can do this together. We don't have to wait for external factors to push us into this. For those of us who struggle with seeing it just as paper, I want to invite us now into our child self, right? It's important for us to tap into our child self. I know we have education, we're ministers, we're ordained, we're commissioned, we have titles, and imagination in a childlike way is not the thing that we do. But something about that childlike imagination has something to offer our adult selves that can help us engage ministry in new and fresh ways. So I would have struggled too with the form, right? This is paper. I can't see beyond the paper. But then there's a part of myself there that says, Darnell, do you remember when you were a kid and you would get the pillows and you were a WWF wrestler and the pillows were your components? Now, you may see it as a pillow now as an adult, but as a child, that pillow was your opponent where you body slammed and threw him against the ropes, all these things. And you too know what it means to transform your room, transform spaces, transform things to be something else. But somehow we have lost the ability to think in that way. But that childlike reality needs to be stirred up within us that we may imagine together new possibilities. Folks on the margins, folks who've been oppressed in our country and beyond, have often have lack of resources but big imagination. Resources have been few, but there's been the ability to imagine even in the midst of little resources. And some of us are finding ourselves, we may not have necessarily been marginalized because of our identity, but because of church life, we are beginning to see what it means to have little resources. And we're learning that little resources doesn't mean that imagination has to go out the window. It actually means imagination can really thrive in the spaces of little resources. But we don't have enough budget, enough people. Little resources, little amounts of people are fertile ground for imagination to really unfold. So let's not make the excuses of we don't have the budget. We don't have the folks. But we got to look at black folks, brown folks, poor folks, and see how people have, for years and years, and even today, taking nothing and made things out of nothing, made things stretch. This is what it means to be people of imagination. So we have to be willing to move beyond the form. We have to also be willing to make mistakes, to fail. We don't do well with failure. Church people don't do well with failure. Even though we know God's grace is sufficient, we don't really want to have to test that sufficiency. We don't do well with trying that new idea, inviting the church to get along, and it fails, and they say, hey, it didn't work out. What have we learned? How do we move forward? We want to make sure that before we engage it, it's going to work. And I want to say, friends, that's not necessarily the faith journey. The faith journey is getting enough light to take the next step ahead of you, not knowing fully what the end will be. So, friends, when we think about failure, I got Post-its intentionally. Do we know the story of the Post-it? Some of us do. Okay, so we know that the Post-it happens by accident, right? The person who was creating the Post-it was a scientist trying to create a strong adhesive, and it didn't quite stick well. It was a light stick. But do you see how his failure of being able to do what he sought to do has become a blessing to us all as we put sticky notes on our desk and we use them every day? But somebody was trying to imagine a new possibility and they failed to live into what they thought they needed to do. But by default of them trying and imagining and exploring, they have found a way to bless us all. So maybe when you try something and it doesn't work out, maybe when you try something and it doesn't necessarily fall where you want it to fall, maybe you will still find yourself in a way that you could bless yourself and bless others because you did what? You tried. You explored. I hope this is blessing somebody, because I've learned that in the midst of trying, in the midst of falling down, that also can be a way of being a blessing to others. So as we think about not needing to be afraid to fail, not being attached to the form, then we move into a place of recognizing that imagination leads to innovation. Imagination leads to innovation. Where are because we're all of a generation, and I'm of a generation of the VCR. Can you almost see it? Can you press rewind and hear that film going fast, a million miles as you try to find that right spot to get back to where you're trying to rewind to? You hear that humming of the VCR? Now, can you imagine VCR blockbuster days, renting movies? Hollywood video. Can you imagine those days when you would go, you were just proud to be able to go on Friday night and get you some videos to watch on the weekend? Can you put yourself in that place in line at Blockbuster, and then somehow somebody comes to you and says, you could actually go home and stream that movie? Can you imagine being in 1997 and hearing somebody say, you can go home and stream that movie? You would have no mental concept of what are you talking about? This is a VCR. This is how I watch my movies. We had no imagination of what could be when it comes to being able to stream a movie off the internet. This is what innovation is. Innovation puts us in a place where we recognize that the form that we see now, there are infinite more possibilities of how that form could be. We need to stop having VCR kind of church in the midst of streaming movies. VCR church says that, well, this is the sacred way of doing things. No, this is just the way we've done things. But we can also see the sacred from the VCR to the DVD player to then streaming videos. How do we move ourselves and our churches into a place of moving from the VCR? And I know we can go down a list of the things that keep us from being able to get there. You say, I'm already at streaming and my people that I serve, they're at VCR. Well, how do we get ourselves to a place of cultivating a culture where we can imagine together? I wonder how our board meetings look. Do we carve out space to say, hey, friends, we're just going to simply take 30 minutes of this meeting, and we know our budget, we know we all know what we're facing reality-wise, but we're going to just play for 30 minutes. We're just going to imagine for 30 minutes what this church could be, how worship could be. We're just going to try on things, and nobody's opinion is crazy. That one small movement, it at least allows the ideas and thoughts to become named out loud for others to hear, for people to then work that muscle of imagination. Right now, it's just talk around the board meeting table. But in the future, those become seeds of people saying, maybe we want to actually try those things on now. Remember when you said last week about maybe we could probably remove the pews? Oh, wow, that's big. We can maybe get chairs. Like, maybe we want to try that now. But because you gave us space and saw the work of imagining and putting that in the space of board meetings and worship services, it allowed our church to be able to understand that imagination is okay, dreaming is okay, thinking outside of the box is okay, and it begins to slowly shift a culture. Can't say in a matter of a couple of sharings, the church is ready to do radical things, but what I can say is it opens a door that perhaps has not yet been opened. Maybe you only imagine in your office. Maybe you just imagine with your colleagues. And that imagination, it feels like it's stifled, like it's stuck. I can't go to the church and imagine. I only can imagine with my colleagues in my office. What does it mean to open up the door for your people to imagine with you? And to do so without attachment to the outcome. We're just doing it to be doing it, because it's important for us as people of faith to always be forward-leaning, thinking about new possibilities. This is our work together. So when we think about imagination and innovation and being able to take the form, the church, as I said, is not the form that we inherited. This is not the original form, friends. Gathering in a sanctuary in a nice building is not the original form. So if it's not the original form, it means that there can be more forms. And it can be more forms, and they can also be just as sacred and just as holy as this form. But we have a hard time of being able to let go of the form. As a new church planter, I can recall early days of having worship, in-person worship. And because we met in a gym, which that's pretty okay, but it was our musical style. We didn't have people that had large church backgrounds leading in our music department. We were singing songs that also were not just out of the hymnal, but songs that may have come from R&B that had meaning to it, that invoked spiritual realities and spiritual thought. And people would say, this just doesn't feel like church. I just doesn't feel like church. But the reality is, this does not feel like the form. It's church. It just does not feel like the form. And we must give ourselves permission to allow the form to be stretched, transformed, and renewed. I know you all have stories about the form changing and the form transforming. I want to hear that at some point in this time together. But I want us to think about imagination leads to innovation, changing the form, something new evolving. Now imagination leads to liberation. This is where we get a little tricky. We recognize the story of Exodus is a story of liberation. If Moses and the people were unwilling to imagine seeing new forms, i.e., the rock, the sticks, the river, they would have jeopardized getting to liberation. They had to be willing to get beyond the forms of what they saw certain things as in order to get to the place of liberation. One more time. If they ignored and only saw rocks as rocks and rivers as rivers and sticks as sticks and was unwilling to even engage and explore that could be something else, they would not get to the place of liberation. Friends, if we are unwilling to challenge the forms, if we're unwilling to raise questions, we will not get to the place of liberation. Liberation meaning the kingdom of God here on earth as it is in heaven. Some of us will be stuck because we will not challenge the forms. This is holy work, friends. This is sacred work. I recognize I think about the biblical witness of Moses and the children of Israel, that they give us a glimpse of what we are to be and who we are to be. That we are to be a people who are open to God's possibilities. Moses tells these folks, I'm going to lead you to a place that God will show us. That takes courage and imagination. And that is our call to invite our people to go somewhere they've never seen before, perhaps. Just because you've never seen it doesn't mean that it won't be a place that will bless you. Just because you've never seen it before doesn't mean it won't touch lives. Just because you've never seen it before doesn't mean it won't impact the community. Just because you've never seen it before doesn't mean that it won't transform communities. This is the work of imagination. Now I'll take a pause. We did a little download. Now I want to hear in this very playful way, because it's okay to play, right? How did you imagine as a child? Tell me about your imagination. Who was the princesses? Who were the policemen? I want to hear this. How is this relevant? I want to know what you perhaps have left behind, because it's already in you. You've already been able to take forms and go from one form, Mama's living room, into making forts and trucks and all these things out of nothing. Now you're an adult, you're a minister, and you're stuck in the form. So tell me about the childlike imagination. Give us a glimpse in. I tell you about my wrestling, WWF days. I want to hear about your imagination. Right here. Can't hear you.
When I was growing up, me and my sister used to have a lot of Barbie dolls, and we would take face towels and VCR tapes and make like a bed and put the face towel over it. Then we would take balled up socks, and that would be the pillow. Then we would take scrunchies and put them around and make like a little tube top and a little skirt. And I would cut, you know what I mean? We would cut those things and make them into their clothes, and they put little head wraps on them. So, my mama didn't like us cutting on socks and stuff, but when we were, thinking about ways to, we didn't have a whole lot of money to always buy them a bunch of clothes, so we would make all these things, bed sheets and pillows and, beds and things for them. And so that was a part of my childhood that was really innovative and imaginative now.
Yes, thank you for sharing. Someone else? Right there, then we'll come to you.
Well, I have to tell you, the story I'm telling, I think, reveals my tendency to stick in form. I loved my teachers in elementary school, and a lot of times they'd give me their extra overhead sheets. Y'all remember overheads? And all their extra other school things. And so I had a school with my dolls with a grade book and lesson plans. I like form.
Form.
And order.
That's real. That's honest.
Give her a break.
My family tried to make me love dolls. I never liked dolls. I had a whole bunch of dolls, and they were pretty, and I would get them all dressed up, and I put them on a shelf. My favorite toy was my red plastic cash register. And I played grocery, and I sold stuff. And my first career was sales for W.W. Granger. I was their first female sales rep.
Wow. Thank you for sharing.
Well, okay, this dates me, but I, as a kid, would love to get in the car that was parked in the carport, because you could get in the car and turn the radio on and listen while you're in the car. But everywhere I went was drive-through. I had my doll and everything in my purse, and I was like going to the bank and going to the grocery store. And everywhere I went was a drive-through, because I was living out of my car. So it's kind of like envisioning what the world now has become. Everything's drive-through.
Thank you for sharing.
I was a tomboy, still am, and my grandparents always wanted me to be more girly, so they kept giving me Barbie dolls, the Barbie camper van, and the Barbie dress up, and Ken, and all the other. But I was into Power Rangers, so the Barbies really only existed so that the Power Rangers had somebody to rescue. That van would crash into the wall, and yeah.
Let's hear these last three right here. 1, 2, 3.
I grew up in southern Texas, in McAllen, the city of palms. And I would go out and take one of the palms that you could pull down the palm tree part, whatever you call that kind of a branch. And I could pull it down in such a way to where it had a kind of a head and then it had a tail, and I could ride that thing. Sometimes it was a horse, sometimes it was a dinosaur, but there were all kinds of things that I could do with that.
Thank you for sharing.
I am a Depression. I grew up during the Depression, and we didn't have much. We did go have the catalogs that came through the mail, all the time, and so I didn't have any toys per se. So I would cut squares out of the magazine and pretend that they were automobiles, and I would push these little squares around the floor, and each they're different automobiles, and that's my imagination.
Yes, thank you for sharing. We have one final one right there.
When I was a kid, we had sharks in our family room.
Shark.
Yeah, and gigantic octopi, is that the proper term? Our sofa was a raft. And I used to spend lots of time throwing these huge boulders that looked a lot like pillows at the creatures in the water. But that would come to an end if it started to snow, because at the end of the room was a big window with drapes. And of course, I had to go open the drapes so that I could see the movie White Christmas once again.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. Thank you all for sharing. So with this being said, I want to just do a kind of a self-assessment. We have heard from generations, actually, the way folks imagined. So imagination isn't a new thing. It's been around. Now I want to ask the question of how, from an assessment standpoint, who is struggling with seeing that imagination show up now in their new context, struggling to see that imagination, childlike imagination? Who's struggling maybe with that? Okay. Within yourself. You're struggling within yourself to kind of tap into that which we just described. Okay, so we got a lot of imaginers in here then, it sounds like. So how about that? How about that question right there? Congregation, maybe just struggle. Okay, gotcha. That's important to designate. So when we think about who's in the room, imagination seems to be really running rampant in here pretty well. How do we invite folks into this? Well, one cautionary tale is we don't invite imagination, because when I say imagination leads to liberation, I mean that. God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. There's no jokes about it, no gimmicks about it. But I don't want us ever to kind of co-opt imagination to be a tool for church growth. Now, your church may grow because of imagination, but we don't do it that the church will grow the way we understand it to grow numerically, right? So imagination, when you invite your folks to do it, we want to always make sure the cautionary tale is we don't position imagination and trying new things as a gimmick to get people, a gimmick to be relevant. We do imagine because we recognize the importance of social impact, community transformation, caring about the least of these. And in doing so, you're right, things may happen. People may be added. We may have attention, but we're not doing it in order to get that attention. We're not doing it in order to recruit people necessarily to our church or to our faith. We're doing it because we're being faithful disciples. So imagination and inviting churches to imagine needs to come from a space that we invite them to see the biblical roots of it, help them understand how the world they live in now that they enjoy is because of imagination and innovation. Whatever you enjoy, whether it's the car, the automobile, the television, these seats, we are all, this very moment, this microphone, everything, these lights is because of innovation. Somebody said, we're going to create a microphone that can go over the ear. At one point, that was probably crazy. A microphone over the ear, we're used to holding mics. But because somebody said, maybe we can take the form and move it forward, that we invite people to recognize the normacy of innovation, and that church cannot be a place where it's off limit to innovation. So if the world around us is being innovated, right? Technology, phones, and everything is evolving and changing, why would the church be off limits to that? Or should the church rather maybe be the catalyst? We should be the place that shows the world, yeah, imagination is for real, because we imagine a better world. We imagine new possibilities, and this is how we do it. So maybe we should be the ones modeling what courageous imagination looks like. Well, friends, these are some barriers to imagination. This is for you. It's also for your people that you serve. Imagination requires rest. One more time. Imagination requires rest, which is probably why God made sure Moses had the people honor the Sabbath on this journey, because y'all are going to be moving toward this place of imagination and new reality, but I want to make sure you're making time to rest, because otherwise you won't be able to see what it is I'm calling you to. You'll be too fatigued. You'll be too caught up in the to-do list. I want to make sure you have time to honor the Sabbath, because we're on a journey together, and it's going to require some stillness, some replenishment. And some of us as clergy folks, we struggle to imagine as our full capacity, perhaps, is because we're fatigued. because we're tired. And in the book, Rest as Resistance, the writer suggests that rest becomes a portal for imagination. That when we take naps, when we say, I'm not going to do anything today for an hour or two, I'm not going to do anything and not feel bad about it. Because in doing so, I'm putting myself in the posture to be able to really imagine, to see more clearly. But instead, the motto is do more, which means you get more. But actually, if we do less, we may see more, that we can do more. Rest is possible. Even in the midst of all the demands, I will stand by it that we can find ways, even if we have to work together to make sure our colleagues and friends have space to rest, that they can strengthen their imagination, and that our people, again, local church, so I have New Church hat, and I also serve a church in Texas City, a First Christian Texas City, which is an older congregation. And I made sure as churches' numbers are declining, people have been serving in the same roles for years and years. And the board just seemed to continue to move from like moderator to treasurer. Next year you're treasurer, then you're the vice moderator. I'm like, wow, you're tired. And if you're tired, then you can't imagine with us. So how do we rethink this board that you can get some rest, which means reconfigure it so you can have a season to rest and replenish? Because if you're fatigued and overwhelmed, then when I invite us to a place of imagination, you're not going to be able to do it because you're overwhelmed. You're probably burnt out. So if you have folks in your congregation who are serving faithfully, they mean well, but they are just doing entirely too much, how do we find ways to say, hey, I want to invite you to rest because the rest is going to be essential for us to get to this next place that we're going? That we invite ourselves and those in which we serve to take time to rest. Imagination requires practice. Practice. I gave the example of what it means to put it into our board meetings, put it into our congregational life, put it into our preaching moments, or there are moments where we invite people to really imagine and think outside the box and be playful. But also for ourselves as clergy, how do we, whether we're involved in certain circles of conversation or we do certain practices that really lead our minds to imagine more, right? Maybe you get some toys, some action figures. Maybe you start drawing and creating things without any agenda of what it will become. Maybe you get some Play-Doh or some clay and you just begin to create things. And you're saying, as I do this, it's a spiritual practice to make sure I'm keeping imagination alive within me. Because I can easily get caught up in the day-to-day of what it means to serve my congregation, that I fail to try on imagination, that I fail to actually engage imagination, that imagination becomes that of a spiritual practice, that I get the piece of paper that Darnell gave us and I try to come up with something new to create with this Post-it note. And the last one will be imagination requires relationship with those on the margins. Imagination requires relationship with those on the margins. What do you mean by that? As I said before, those who are on the margins often have an imagination of what the world can be. If we begin to listen to them and get to know them, hear their hurts, hear their hopes, then that helps enliven us to maybe how our ministry and mission can be shaped and transformed, that we can meet those needs and create God's kingdom here on earth. My time is wrapped up. I want to make some time for us to be able to ask some questions and also to be able to just say out loud of maybe the frustrations, confessional moments of frustration, of lack of imagination around us. Because this is a place where we're restoring it within ourselves, and I hope that you have some nugget that you can begin to slowly plant seeds in your congregational life so that your imagination that you have within is somewhat reflected in the life of your congregation. Maybe you're just planting the seeds for the person who will come behind you. But nevertheless, may you create an environment within your congregation where imagination is a norm and it is seen as sacred and God's work. Amen.
Thank you very much, Darnell, for that inspiring message. So we now have about 15 minutes for interaction with our speaker. So
first, thank you. How have you seen COVID and the pandemic impacting imagination? And how do we as ministers help our congregation to work past that and to revive their imagination?
As shared earlier, for my congregational context, the immediate reality of the pandemic caused them to imagine, because we had to be able to, how do we get together and meet in meaningful ways? So whether it was Zoom or virtual worships, that became a way that folks imagined. What I've seen now is that now that those realities have somewhat shifted is to go back to the default settings. So we have to have a moment of what do we want to carry over from the pandemic? There are things that we did that maybe this was God's invitation in the midst of tragedy and devastation of a global pandemic for us to evolve and grow. And we've had those conversations. There was, within one congregation, we should stop Facebook Live because people should come to church. They should come back to church. Well, maybe we have now expanded our reach, and maybe now we are connecting with people in ways that we will never understand, but we know that as we see the views that people are watching, and that it's not about people having to come back to the form that you once knew.
I'm going to have a rough time articulating what's bouncing between my head and my heart. So sometimes I look at things like I'm pushing an elephant, and I'm pushing as hard as I can and it won't move. And sometimes I realize I'm the elephant. But when it comes to worship, for instance, I'm pretty much a traditionalist. Just in the form of worship, not in progressive thinking or changing movements or that sort of thing. And talking today and being challenged to think in terms of my childhood imagination, I'm realizing that with worship, lots of times, it provokes memories of a simpler time in my life, a time of security and awe. And sometimes it's hard to feel awe in our present day world. I don't want to be that way. I want to allow for change in worship form. But the reality is some of the traditional things just have such a rich and powerful message for me that I'm the elephant being pushed by myself.
Thank you for sharing that. I know that was more of a comment, but I would want us to, it's important for us to own our stuff, what you did, and also recognize that oftentimes we want to freeze God in a time period, that you experienced God in this time period and it was rich and it was all, you experienced all, and God can also be experienced all again in a new time period in fresh ways, while still, not either or, and you can also visit and incorporate some of the elements from the past. But it's not an either or, but it's definitely when we just see it as this represents yesteryear, and it was very inspiring and touching. So we have to stay there, as if God has to stay there, God can't be somewhere else. Then I think we're missing something there.
First of all, thank you so much for your insight and the call to imagination. I love imagining. My problem is that a lot of times I'm trying, much like my friend here, I'm trying to figure out where does my imagination fit in the things that are needed. One of the things that we're struggling with in our church is there is an imagination that takes us totally away from being church, right? Until we become a social club and a social organization. What can you give us, or can you give us something that can help us move from that imagination to innovation, and not just staying at imagination and we're implementing what we imagine, but we are innovating and then moving towards our liberation?
Yeah. So I would say the form that does not change is the good news of the gospel, the good news of God's kingdom being preached, right? Inviting us into a new way of being together, God's shalom. That form stays the same, but the way in which that news is shared and lived out in community can change. So that becomes the line in the sand for us. How is what we're doing reflecting the gospel of the kingdom of God, and how are we engaging new practices that further enhance that? May look different, right? Because I think the way I grew up with it, that was only shown by the preacher preaching. The preacher preaches, that's how the gospel is preached. That's it. There are other forms, there are other ways of still embodying, whether in word and in deed, and that becomes the line in the sand. So I think we have to define as a congregation, which is a theological moment, what is the line in the sand for us, that this defines us, and then from there we innovate. But if it's a list of 25 things, friends, then I think we may need to take a deep breath, because if it's 25 things that are line in the sand, that's really going to keep us from being able to go forward. Let's remember Christ as our doctrine, Christ as the one who is our central uniter as disciples. Let's stay around there. Let's stay around that subject and not go too far in the weeds that we can't imagine.
Thank you for your talk. My first appointment as a pastor was a cross-cultural appointment. So I was a fairly young, obviously, black woman, and my congregation was all white and all 65 and up. Mm-hmm. One of the good times, in the mountains of Colorado.
Oh, yes.
And an extremely Republican. So my question was, the last point that you reflected on was imagining from the margins, with people from the margins. And as much as I did book studies, as much as I sat, because I felt like across the pulpit, it's difficult to really have a nuanced conversation. And so, but one of the things that I encountered, it almost felt disingenuous or inauthentic, trying to help or walk with my congregation to have those conversations across the margins because they lived in a particular silo. And for me to be like, oh, we're gonna go sing at the black church, there was no black church, but we're gonna do this, and we're gonna, it just, you know what I mean? Like it was difficult when you have a people that are so, ingrained in their identity and their culture and their age, that has a lot to do with it. And so I was just wondering if you could offer some ways to authentically speak with people from the margins or people that have been decentered, and in ways that don't feel so, let's just hold hands so we can hurry up and try to get to somewhere we want to be.
Yeah. Thank you. So as one who serves a congregation, I told you about in person, it's also that same demographic, at least not necessarily politically, but racially, age-wise. It is definitely burdensome to be the black clergy person trying to invite people into those conversations, and I've learned now that I've drawn a pretty much a boundary there, like that's too much work for me to do by myself. So I think it's important for us to bring in stories, and I'm not talking about stories in a book story, I meant stories of individuals where we have to begin to be collectors of stories of those on the margins, and they become our sacred text. So we gather together and we talk about the reality of the single black mother who works at Walmart, working a full-time job just to be poor. And we just begin she's not there, but we carry her story in sacredly, right? Because her being there could also be harmful, right?
Right.
So we want to make sure we bring in the story and we just become the person who carries the story. And even if it becomes like a way of Lectio Divini, where we hear the story, we sit with the story, But I think it's important in the early stages to do as less harm as we can to ourselves as the person of color clergy, and then also bringing other people in. And then from there, we find meaningful ways to connect with folks in community that feel authentic, which takes a sense of intentionality, right? We're not just going to do some missionizing, but we're going to build authentic relationship. And that also depends upon context. What you described sounds a little tricky, but not impossible. It definitely sounds like the starting point for me would be bringing in sacred stories.
So my question would be around generational gaps. A lot of the folks that I serve, that I've done ministry with, are younger, queer people of color. And these communities are full of innovation. They are the innovation generation, right? So they all about that. And then when they come into the form of the church that has been traditional, it can almost be like tradition versus imagination. And so what a lot of young people have done is they have journeyed away from that work, yet they long for some of those sacred spaces. But when you go into the physical space, there is no room for imagination, no room for innovation, no room for, a self-affirming identity. There's no room. So if you could speak to how do we have these cross-generational conversations about imagination and the desire for folks to be in a space where they can feel sacred and affirmed.
Yeah. So I definitely want to affirm that we have within our tradition, which I'm sure you're probably aware of, there are spaces that are being created by planters to provide that space for people to come from the margins and be able to imagine and bring their innovation and ideas. So we give thanks for that, but that doesn't mean that's the end of the conversation. So when it comes to intergenerational conversation, what we need to become clear on is, I'm a millennial, so I know my patience is very low when it comes to change, right? And to some degree, rightfully so. One would say that when we boil it all down, our ideas, what things we're clinging on to, going back to Bishop Bird's idea, what matters the most, right? Because we can talk about we can go line by line from music to style of worship, all these things, preaching, but let's just really say what matters the most. And then from there, we begin to say, this is what matters the most, Generation X, and this is why. Then how is what matters the most being seen in the practices in our church? Because right now, we often start from the practices. That becomes the argument, the practice, the thing we're doing, and not what, and you only can pick one or two things that matter most. And let's put that into an idea, a concept. Maybe it's community, maybe it's fellowship. Okay, if you really value fellowship, then why are you mad about what song we're singing? You said for you, fellowship is very important to you, togetherness and breaking bread together. Then why are you arguing tooth and nail about the hymnals? So we need to kind of understand what is the meaningful moments for people in our congregational life across generations, and then begin to explore how what's meaningful reflects the practices. So for some people, it is music. That is very important to them. So therefore, they will, die on that hill. Okay. But let's understand what's important, and let's boil it down to only 1 to 2 things that are important.
We have time for one more comment or question.
Right. I might be misunderstanding, but it seems like we're talking about exercise or existence of imagination as a dichotomy to no imagination. And it seems like maybe there's a competition of imaginations, and the forces that we're trying to meet are very good at casting imagination. Even the image of what the church used to be and what society used to be and all of that is, comes more from Leave It to Beaver or whatever than a reality, but it's an imagination of supposed lived reality. There's imagination cast about, what certain groups are intending for children, or the message that they're sending. All of those are casting imagination. So aren't we really in the business of competing imaginations, and how do we meet that? Does that ring true?
I think I'm hearing you correctly. So we're offering a counter narrative to some of the things that are being projected onto us, right? what it means to, in a world that says we're me, myself, and I culture, for us to have a counter culture there that says, no, we're collective. One that says that the bottom line is money, that we say the bottom line is impact. So we're offering counter narratives to that which we're seeing around us. So it is imagination against imagination to some degree. You are right in that.
Thank you very much. Again, let's give Reverend Daniel Ferrell a big hand.
One quick plug. We have a table outside. NBA has a table, have some cards on the table. Also, you can visit our site, nbacares.org. We'd love to just be in conversation about pastors who are just thinking outside the box and maybe have some ideas that they want to explore. We'd love to be your conversation partner.